Everybody. Thank you for being here. Oh, there's the mic. Thank you for being here. Please feel free to wander down toward the center. Sunday morning, the usual protocol is people wandering in as we start ramping up. So I think the room will start to fill out pretty quickly, but in the meantime, please feel free to move yourself to the front and the center to make sure that we can have the sort of intimate discussion around these important issues that I think we're all aiming for. I'm going to begin with just a few short announcements before we get to this morning's main event, which I know we're all pretty excited for. So as ever, and as you've probably already discovered, we're serving fair trade coffee and tea throughout the day. Hopefully you've brought your own mug. We also have disposable mugs for purchase if needed. Disposable mugs are available at a cost of $2. If you have any questions about the conference, anything that you still want to know at this late point in this weekend's events, please feel free to look for someone with a name tag that says volunteer or staff. If we don't know your question, we will find out someone who does and ensure that you're positioned to have the best experience that you can this weekend. And we'd also like to remind you that Parkland, of course, relies exclusively on donations from people like you. None of this could happen without your participation and support. That is true in every sense of the word. If you've enjoyed this weekend, if you want us to have the capacity to keep doing what we're doing, to even expand and build on the work we do, please consider offering us support, particularly in the form of a monthly donation, or increasing the support if that's something that's within the realm of what's possible for you at this time. Thank you for your continued support. If you make a donation of at least $10 a month, that puts you at a level at which we're happy to supply you with printed copies of all our publications so you can acquire your own Parkland Institute library if that would be of value to you. Of course, all our reports are always available free online, so check that out. We also offer charitable receipts for our donations. So if you fill out a pledge form here, you can expect to receive a receipt for your donation in the mail over the next little while. So there's also that advantage. While you're at the Parkland table here, you can also check out some of our recent research in hard copy. We'd be glad to talk to you both about what we've done recently, what we have on the go over the next 6 months or so. It's always a pleasure to have those conversations. I should say, at the top it says introduce yourself, and I didn't do that. I'm Shannon Sundenbauer. I'm the research director at Parkland Institute. If you want to hear about the research we do, please come talk to me. I'd be grateful for the opportunity. We'd like to take a few moments to thank our conference sponsors again, the Alberta Federation of Labour, Athabasca University, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Civic Service Union Local 52, Health Sciences Association of Alberta, the United Nurses of Alberta, the University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, and the Woodsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. Those groups, organizations have made substantial contributions to enable us to do all of this with all of you, so we're grateful for their support. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our media sponsors for their generous support. And here we're looking at Alberta Views Magazine, View Weekly, and CJSR Radio. So, all right, well, let's get to the main event then. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to introduce Gordon Laxer. He's familiar to many of you, I'm sure. He is the founding director of Parkland Institute and also taught political economy at the University of Alberta for 31 years. He wrote or edited 5 books and over 35 journal articles and book chapters. Dr. Laxer is now an author on permanent sabbatical, as he describes it. I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. And his latest book, which will soon be published, is on energy and ecological security for Canadians, and it's on the basis of this work that he's going to be speaking to us today. And Dr. Laxer says that in 2 or 3 or the coming decades, people will have access to much less energy than today. This is a looming consideration that we all need to think about in some pretty concrete ways. The key question, one of the key questions, is how, in an energy-constrained world, who will have access to sufficient energy? And this will be one of the key considerations fought out between people on the one hand and profiteers on the other hand. So here's Gordon to address one of our key conference themes from the perspective of energy security in Canada.
Thank you. It's great to be back at Parkland and at Edmonton. I really miss you people. Been away for 2 years, but this is my real political community. And this has been a wonderful conference. And I've, again, Parkland has excelled at what it does. My job on a Sunday morning is to wake you up. And I'm going to do that as best I can, but don't avoid the coffee. The coffee will help as well. My talk is about energy shortages, especially oil shortages, in the near future. Will the rich and the military in Canada and other countries corner the supplies of scarcer energy, or will ordinary people be able to get it? We have to stop them and remove their political power if we want to get to a low-carbon society, conservative society, based on sufficiency, energy sufficiency for everyone, energy access as a human right. It's a myth that ramping up renewables will be enough to maintain our energy-intensive lifestyles. We must power down, work fewer hours, buy less, have more free time, live on a guaranteed annual income, and enjoy each other and nature more. That's what I'm going to be talking about. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'm going to go through this step by step. How credible is my claim that we're at the end of the age of easy or cheap oil and the urgent need to think through the shortages that are coming and the distribution of that energy? Well, 2014 in Alberta is a tough time and a place to convince you of this. First of all, you live in the province with the third largest recoverable oil reserves in the world. The sands, I don't call them oil sands or tar sands, has enough recoverable oil to supply Canadians for 2 centuries at current production and Canadian oil demand levels, if we just supplied ourselves. Secondly, Albertans and everyone else in the world, of course, who's been following this, has heard about the surge in US shale oil and gas. There's amazing claims made about it, 100 years of natural gas. The US is now the number one world oil producer. The US is going to be energy self-sufficient and independent. This year, the US oil exports hit a 57-year high. Third, the US energy surge has been touted as ushering in an energy revolution and a new age of oil and gas abundance. The peak oil theory is proclaimed dead. Fourth, as if to confirm the theory of oil's abundance, Brent crude oil hit $75 a barrel. This week, it's a 35% drop from June, when it was around $118 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate has also fallen about the same amount. So falling international oil prices, they actually result from greater supply, reduced demand because of the recession or slow world economic growth, and fewer oil disruptions. So how can I possibly get up here and claim that the world faces the end of easy or cheap oil? That Canadians are vulnerable to oil and other energy shortages, and that even that middle and low income Albertans could have difficulty paying for enough energy to heat their homes and get to work in 10 or 20 years. Well, okay, I'm going to start to try and convince you of the contrary evidence. Okay, so Alberta has the sands has all of this oil, but they can't be produced quickly. It's the ATM problem. You may have enough money in your account, but the amount that you can withdraw each day is limited. Now, Now think of the I want you to think of the number 90. I don't have visuals here. I'm the visual, I guess. Think of 90 as the number of millions of barrels of oil per day that the world produces, so 90, okay? The sands are not likely to produce more than 5 million barrels a day. Today, it's 2 million barrels a day. And it's actually taken almost 50 years, from 1967, when the sands started, to get up to 2 million barrels a day. So the projected growth is 150% in the next 15 years. That may be possible if we continue to ignore the climate change catastrophes and the international boycotts that I think will be developing of sands oil. But even if the sands reaches 5 million barrels a day, that would still only supply 5.5% of the world's oil. And the depletion rate from conventional oil, the huge finds, the elephant finds of oil that were found decades ago, they are declining at the rate of 4% a year. So the sands actually makes up, even if it gets up to 5 million barrels a day, it's only going to make up a little over a year's depletion of the world's biggest fields. So Canada is not an energy superpower, and the sands are not a world game changer in providing energy. But they are a catastrophe for the climate. The New York-based Council on Foreign Relations, it's an elite organization with very close ties to Washington, did a study, a report on the Alberta's oil sands. It shows that falling carbon emissions in Canada is incompatible with rising sands production. And I quote from it, "Imagine that oil sands emissions rose as expected over the next 2 decades and then stabilized in 2030, while total US and Canadian emissions dropped by 80% by 2050. And that's the goal, by the way, that the Canadian Parliament passed in 2008, that we will cut our emissions by 80% by 2050. I continue to quote, "Oil sands emissions then become equivalent to 10% of US emissions and by 2050 and represent almost all emissions in Canada." So if Canada cuts emissions by 80%, the sands are going to take up all of the emissions. So everything else that we do, drive to work, everything else would have to be cut off in order for the sands to get up to that production level. In 2012, Canada squandered 1.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas a day to make dirty sands oil, the majority of which was exported to the US. The sands are forecast to burn up 2 billion cubic feet of natural gas, or 20% of Canada's gas by next year. And how smart is that? We have 10 years left of proven reserves of natural gas. Former Alberta Treasurer Jim Dinning likened the use of natural gas in the sands to reverse alchemy. Injecting, and I quote, "Injecting natural gas into the oil sands to produce oil is like turning gold into lead." He got that right. Most rich countries are complacent about coming world oil shortages because they rely on forecasts from the Paris-based International Energy Agency, the IEA. It's established under the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. The International Energy Agency represents the 28 rich consuming countries as the counterpart to OPEC, and it's led by Washington. Canada is a member. Britain's Guardian newspaper a couple of years ago ran some articles on the International Energy Agency and their objectivity. A senior IEA official who requested anonymity for fear of reprisals said the world is much closer to running out of oil than the IEA admits. It has deliberately underplayed a looming shortage for fear of triggering panic buying The US encourages the IEA to underplay the decline rates from existing fields and overplays the chances of finding new reserves, the official said. For years, the IEA repeatedly poo-pooed the theory of peak oil. And then in its 2010 World Energy Outlook, the report nonchalantly stated, and I quote, "Crude oil output reaches an undulating plateau of 68 to 69 million barrels a day." Remember I said the number 90 you should keep in your mind. But never regains its all-time peak of 70 million barrels, so this is conventional oil. It reached in 2006. So here the International Energy Agency has been saying there is no peak oil, and now it's said it's happened, but it's in the past. It's already happened. The IEA pins its hope on for additional production from natural gas liquids, unconventional oil like the sands and shale oil, and Iraq. They pin a tremendous number of their hopes on Iraq. After the US shale oil boom declines, and it's predicted to decline starting in 2018 or 2019. Even the US government says that by 2019 it's going to start declining. They count on a growing supply of oil for the next 20 years to come mainly from the Middle East, when the bulk of it coming from Iraq. Now, how crazy is that? Much is riding on Iraq's success, so much in the 2012 World Energy Outlook by the International Energy Agency said that Iraq will make the largest contribution by far to global oil supply growth. Well, for 2 decades, Washington has hoped that its invasions and bombings of Iraq would produce more oil under Washington-friendly conditions. Yet Iraq still produces less oil than it did before the first Gulf War. So much for the effectiveness of US-led wars for oil. And why should the ISIL insurgency in Iraq be any different? Combatants regularly blow up oil pipelines. So the IEA assumes that 40% of oil production in 2035 will need to come from fields not yet found. That sounds like the wishful thinking of economists, and economists have had a tremendous influence at the International Energy Agency, who forecast future demand, and then they say, well, supply is just going to come with the price. If the price goes higher, it's going to induce greater supply. Geologists know better. David McLeod, a Washington State peak oil activist, writes that at some point, geology responds less and less to the human construct we call money. Former Shell chairman Lord Ron Oxburgh wrote that, quote, "There isn't any shortage of oil, but there is a real shortage of the cheap oil. It is pretty clear that there is not much chance of finding any significant quantity of new cheap oil." A former senior IEA source, International Energy Agency source, said a key imperative at the IEA was not to anger the Americans. There is not much world oil, as world oil has been stated. We have already entered the peak oil zone. The situation is really bad. The IEA, of course, rejected the whistleblowers' allegations. Christophe de Margerie headed France's huge oil giant, Total Petroleum, until he was killed in a plane crash last month. De Margerie insisted the oil will soon top out at 95 million barrels a day. Remember I said the number 90 is what's produced today. And no amount of investment, he said, or ingenuity can push it higher. And I quote, "There will be a lack of sufficient energy available. Peak oil will come more from political resistance than supply limits. The problem is not so much with resources," said de Margerie, "it is how to extract resources in an acceptable manner." In addition to these insights of former oil titans, it must be noted that there are 3.5 times as many countries where oil-producing countries that are in decline, that are past peak, compared to those where oil production is rising. 37 countries are declining in oil production, and only 11 countries are they rising. Canada is in the latter category. Well, what about the US shale oil revolution? It's impressive in the short run, but it's much overblown. Richard G. Miller, a former British petroleum geologist, states that US light tight oil, which is fracked shale oil, may reach 5 or 6 million barrels a day. That's about 6% of world production. So it's going to peak, though, in the next few years. Canadian geoscientist David Hughes analyzed actual production data instead of looking at forecasts based mainly on demand. He actually analyzed production in the top 7 shale oil and shale gas plays in the United States, and he found that the U.S. government Energy Information Administration has greatly overestimated future shale oil and gas production. The U.S. government predicts that there will be 1 million barrels a day will still be produced by 2040. David Hughes said, no, it's going to be 73,000. It's going to be down almost to nothing. Because he shows that the decline rates in the 2 biggest fields of shale oil, in North Dakota, the Bakken field, has declined 85% in 3 years. That's the decline rate of each well. And in Eagle Ford in Texas, it's 79%. So the 3 years, it declines incredibly. Although it has a record of overly rosy forecasts, the U.S. Energy Information Administration predicts that even with the shale oil boom and future cuts in oil demand because of the new regulations on automobiles, fuel standards, the U.S. is still going to import 1/4 to 1/3 of its oil. So it's not going to be energy independence. So much for that, and so much for net U.S. oil exports. Well, if we're not going to be, there's going to be a decline then in cheap oil and easy oil, what about renewables? And by the way, I didn't get a chance to see the film last night, and so I can't comment on that. It might present something quite different from what I'm saying here. We humans have to get off carbon fuels as quickly as possible and get down to the low carbon society to slow and eventually reverse carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Rising ocean levels threatening to erase island nations and shoreline communities, the melting of the world's glaciers that provide fresh water for hundreds of millions of people, horrific storms like Superstorm Sandy, droughts and many other climate change disasters demand it. We have to live within nature's limits. Humans are part of nature, not above it. We all know these things. But we have to quickly act and not be paralyzed by the enormity of the task. Canada looms large in causing emissions. Big oil and its conservative government backers want us to believe that Canada is a bit player. Whatever we do won't matter, so let's not do anything, is their stance. That's not true. Canada has 0.5% of the world's population, and we produce 2.5% of the greenhouse gases in the world. What gives Canadians the right to emit 5 times the per capita level of emissions into the world's common atmosphere than our population warrants? Besides, with this month's US-China agreement on climate change to limit emissions, the excuse that the big polluters aren't doing anything is now gone. Many environmentalists, though, sell the illusion that we can simply switch to renewables and continue to live as energy intensively as now. They assume that the renewables, even on a massive scale, are benign. Well, and I'm going to show you that that isn't so. Germany is touted as a pioneer. You've heard of that, along with Denmark and several other countries. Germany is touted as a pioneer in the move to renewables. Its 24,000 windmills and 1.4 million solar panels, and that's pretty impressive, generate up to 74% of Germany's electricity on very windy and very sunny days. Very impressive. But energy classed as renewables actually only supplies 12% of Germany's energy, all of its kinds of energy. And over 60% of that is actually from biofuels like pellets, not from solar panels or wind. All those windmills and solar panels have hardly made a dent in Germany's greenhouse gas emissions. And it raises the question of, do we need to make more fundamental changes than just assuming we can get rid of the carbon fuels and just plug in renewables, and then we'll just carry on in our energy wasteful ways? It's very unlikely that renewables can be built on a sufficient scale to replace the energy that we currently use, not even close. Scientists Anastasia Makarieva and her colleagues studied a massive global switch to renewables. It would not stop climate change and would harm the atmosphere, they conclude. And I quote, "It is commonly assumed that environmental stability can be preserved if one manages to switch to clean, pollution-free resources, energy resources, with no change in the total energy consumption rate. Climate and environment can only remain stable if anthropogenic pressure on natural ecosystems is diminished, which is unachievable without reducing the global rate of energy consumption." And they cite the example of wind power. And I quote, "When the moisture-laden ocean-to-land winds are on their way to land impeded by windmills, this steals moisture from the continent and undermines the water cycle on land. Wind power is equivalent to deforestation. Wind power stations can thus be allowed to exempt less than 1% of total wind power. Total available renewable resources, hydro, wind, tidal, and solar, can, quote, ensure no more than 1/10 of modern energy consumption," they conclude. Andrew Nikiforuk, and we've had Andrew here at Parkland conferences, including a couple of years ago, he agrees and he explains why renewables can't simply replace carbon fuels. And Nikiforuk says, "Renewables by definition harvest less energy than do densely packed fossil fuels. Like unconventional hydrocarbons such as bitumen and shale gas, they require intensive industrial farming. They also create greater landscape disturbances. To replace a 1,000-megawatt coal-fired plant sitting on 1.5 square miles of land with solar panels would require a small city-sized area of 19 square miles. To achieve the same energy with wind could take an area 3 times bigger. Meeting 1/3, and this is only 1/3 of the world's current energy needs with wind power, would require approximately 13 million towers spaced half a mile apart, occupying 3 million square miles, approximately 5% of the world's total land mass, and it would cost $15 trillion. That's trillion, not billion. Windmills would occupy good farmland and displace forests, which are the lungs of the world. Wind and solar are, of course, intermittent power sources. In the United Kingdom, they calculated that if you installed 15 wind turbines in every kilometer around the coast of the United Kingdom, it would supply only 13% of the country's average daily energy use. And offshore turbines, of course, are more efficient than onshore ones. So generating that 13% of energy for the UK from offshore wind would require wind turbines made of 20 million tons of steel and concrete, more than all the steel that went into US shipbuilding during World War II. Steel manufacturing is heavily dependent on coal and its emissions. Building wind and solar, of course, then, is not carbon neutral. Solar PV panels are up to 4 times as carbon intensive to produce as wind turbines. There's aluminum in them, and they are not carbon neutral. I don't suggest slowing the growth of renewables. Far from it. They currently provide only 1% of the global energy and haven't nearly reached their limits. But let's avoid the delusion that they will enable us to live our energy wasteful ways. As Richard Heinberg convincingly argues, we have to power down to use much less energy intensity. One of the things that, we look back to the golden age of the 30 years after the Second World War. There was something called the Great Bargain between capital and labor, which actually led to much greater energy consumption. The socialists were very strong after the Second World War, and they made a deal really with capital in order to produce the welfare state. They gave up their demands to really change the system, and they said that they agreed to taking higher wages in place of much more basic changes. And the capitalist promise was growth, and they said, don't worry about who has how much. The question is, you will be better off in 10 years and your children will be better off than you. Well, that retort has worn out. The neoliberalism's policies, of course, have led to the wealth being held in much smaller, fewer hands, very, very few hands. But few in either side of those debates seem to realize how much a growing pie depended on cheap energy. Costly energy scales back living standards, raises costs on most things, and it will likely reignite open class conflict. In the age of costly oil and fewer material goods per person, social justice issues of who has how much will return with a vengeance. Should the rich few get most of the Earth's remaining deliverable carbon fuels and have the right to dump unlimited greenhouse gases into humanity's common biosphere, while many do without necessities. And I'm going to show that we can't leave this declining energy per person to free markets. Okay, so I've been arguing that we are going to be living in 2 or 3 decades and much less energy. So we're going to see energy shortages big time. Who will get access? Even Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist who promoted capitalist shock therapy in post-communist Eastern Europe, and he made a lot of money individually from that. Of course, this is what Guy Standing told me last night at supper. Jeffrey Sachs warns, quote, "The rich will try to use their power to commandeer more land, more water, and more energy for themselves, and many will support violent means to do so if necessary." End of quote. Will it be like the US healthcare system, where he or she who has the most money will get the fastest and best care? That's the market model, or will it be like the Canadian Medicare system, where everyone has equal access regardless of ability to pay? will everybody have, be able to heat their homes and get to work? Can we use the same principles of access to energy to devise a system that gets us out of carbon fuels quickly? Well, energy shortages will mean that there must be a rationing system. That's what happens with all scarcities. And two kinds of rationing systems are available. One is invisible and unfair. The other is fair but painfully visible. The first is rationing by high energy prices. Prices rise until demand falls enough to equal supply. And we've heard this model. The other side of the market model will soon be largely unavailable, which is if the price rises, that should bring on greater supply. Because of geology, we're just running out of the low-hanging fruit, and because the world, I hope, quickly moves to getting off carbon fuels because of the great climate change disasters we're moving into. Thus, price for carbon energy is bound to rise, and we have to realize that over 90% of transportation still runs on oil. And we really haven't found a good substitute for that yet. So we've seen that renewable energy will not be available in large quantities, so we're going to go into, there has to be a rationing. So rationing by price is unfair for something as necessary as energy because it allows for frivolous use by the rich, as well as having military jets in the air 24/7, while the 99% do without. Shiver or freeze in the dark. Frivolous and military uses raises greenhouse gases and harms us all. Will we let the market take us where it will? Not choosing, not acting, chooses market solutions by default. There's another way to ration. Adopt fair national plans that are more flexible than the quota system that Canada, US, and Britain adopted in the Second World War, and I'm going to outline such a rationing plan. And they can fairly both cut carbon emissions and fairly distribute the gradually declining energy in, I'm talking about this in my forthcoming book, which I give the title to After the Sands is the title of my book. In Britain, they're called tradable energy quotas, or TEQs. I call them national energy quotas because they apply at the national level. Now, critics will wonder why, when all humans share the world's atmosphere, the plan is not global. Well, we certainly need a tough world agreement to cut carbon emissions and binding targets for each country. Rich countries must cut the most, while the poorest may even be able to raise theirs at first in a plan called contraction and convergence. But national plans can be the most effective, national and local plans, to reduce carbon energy use. Let each country devise its own plan to fit their unique conditions as long as they meet their target. David Fleming, the creator of tradable energy quotas, explained that one global plan to cut emissions would be unstable since it would be vulnerable to breakdowns anywhere in the world, and it would either lose the essential element of a single carbon or energy budget, or else it would attempt to set a single one-size-fits-all budget, which would be unfair and unsuited to the wide diversity of conditions among countries. Fleming added that the large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require small-scale solutions within a large-scale framework. And the tradable energy quotas allow the flexibility for local communities to plan their own solutions and encourage bottom-up democracy along the lines of the transition towns pioneered by Rob Hopkins and others in Britain and Ireland. They could be part of a wider international agreements to control climate, the tradable energy quotas, and distribute scarcer energy in an equitable way. But we can't wait for binding international agreements. Look what happened to the 1997 Kyoto Accord, 17 lost years. Perhaps there is a better chance now that the US and China, neither of which signed on to Kyoto, have made agreement in principle. But even if a binding international agreement isn't reached soon, tradable energy quotas must still proceed in highly polluting countries like Canada. Not only will this help slow climate change, it will start Canada on a needed path to get off depleting and costly oil, natural gas, and coal to create a powered-down society run on renewables. If the rest of the world isn't there yet, Canada can become one of the pioneers rather than the last laggard stuck in its colonial role of hewing wood and drawing oil and falling into a declining fossil fuel belt. Tradable energy quotas require cooperation, democratic input, and trust. People have widely sacrificed for each other at national and local levels, but never globally. And this is why it's best to have national plans, because they're the most effective. Well, how would tradable energy quotas work? Conceived by David Fleming in Britain, tradable energy quotas are the fairest, simplest ways that I've seen to manage carbon energy descent. They're much fairer and more effective than carbon taxes. And I quote from him, "It's hard to set a rate of tax which changes the behavior of higher income groups without causing unacceptable hardship for people on a lower income." And rationing isn't necessarily bad. You hear rationing and it's not all that popular. But an all-party committee in the UK Parliament, they issued a report in 2011 on peak oil, and they explained that rationing, quote, contains two intertwined meanings. The first is guaranteed minimum shares for all. The second is limits to what people are allowed to consume. Many of us resent the second, but in times of shortage, we cry out for the first. Britain's parliamentary committee explains why rationing through price is a bad idea. Quote, "Markets do not distinguish between more and less essential uses of oil. If the global rich," and this is from the British Parliamentary Committee, all-party committee, even including Conservative MPs, it says, if the global rich are willing to and able to pay more to fuel cars and jets than people elsewhere are able to heat their homes or power their hospitals, then the limited supply of oil will flow to the highest bidder. Demand destruction can be cruel or even fatal for those who can no longer afford energy supplies." End of quote. Well, humans have rapidly consumed the low-hanging fruit of oil and natural gas. Like it or not, rationing will come. Rationing is not the cause of shortages, but can be a fair response to them. It's not a question of if, observed Fleming, but when rationing begins, and the sooner we do it, the gentler it will be. Well, in Canada, we haven't considered rationing since it ended in 1947. In wartime, rationing limited consumption in Canada and sent excess food to Britain. Rationing is unpopular today because it's associated with austerity. However, when scarcity hits without a rationing system, people rush to stores to stock up. It's called hoarding. Shelves are soon bare of necessities. Black markets spring up to sell hoarded items at inflated prices. Low-income people quickly suffer. And rationing is meant to fairly distribute scarce necessities. Energy is a necessity and should be a human right. especially in a cold, vast country like Canada. Well, the British, tradable energy quotas were actually passed by the British Parliament, and they don't need further, in 2008, and they don't need further primary legislation to actually implement it. But it was shelved as ahead of its time. In 2011, an all-party parliamentary committee on peak oil unanimously endorsed it and enthusiastically promoted it. Well, how would the energy quotas work? And would Canadians support them, and what are their shortcomings? Well, the energy quotas apply only to energy purchases, not to food and other things. Energy purchases cover most carbon emissions because almost everything we buy requires energy to make it and get to us. A national carbon budget will calculate how much carbon-infused energy Canadians currently consume, and there are three separate allotments. One goes to citizens, and that's, in Britain, it's about 40%, and another to governments and another to business. Each individual adult gets a free weekly carbon energy allowance, and children get them too, whereas businesses and the public sector must buy the remaining units at weekly auctions. So ordinary people get it free. This is a much better system than the cap and trade system like in Europe, the European trading scheme, where absurdly the polluting industries are given free allowances to continue polluting. With national energy quotas, the big polluters pay. Well, all adults, even those without a computer or a cell phone, will get a national energy quota account. The system operates automatically through credit card or debit purchases with no additional action by consumers. And all fuel and electricity will carry a carbon rating. 1 unit represents 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide or its equivalent in the fuel's production and use. And an annual NEQ budget determines the number of units available. It drops, and each year it drops like stairs. So you are going down. It's a carbon descent plan, which is be much gentler than if we just let the cheap oil run out and the rich corner supplies, and then we're suddenly without. Okay. Some consumers won't have any NEQs to offer when buying something, foreign visitors and residents, and they will have to pay for those in their transaction. Surpluses from units not sold, not used, can be sold. Conversely, if someone needs more, that they can be bought. This is an individual trading system. This is not one where investors get involved and where this is only between individuals. And it just makes it a little more flexible, a kind of quota system than the systems we had in the war. But as the energy amount declines, it's going to get tighter and tighter. Okay, governments themselves must adhere to following allotments, but their major role, of course, is to support people in making adjustments to live and thrive in declining carbon energy and growing renewable energy. Governments create and oversee, of course, infrastructure, city design, and regulations like requiring that all new houses be carbon neutral. Governments also set the framework to nurture growing renewable energy supplies and other measures to enable individuals and businesses to reduce carbon energy use. So since it would be in everybody's interest, the NEQ price would be determined by Canadian demand. So it's in everybody's interest to reduce their energy use. And it's in everybody's interest to make sure your neighbors do that. As Fleming wrote, "Your carbon consumption becomes my business. I have an incentive to influence your behavior to our mutual advantage. Lower demand means lower prices of carbon units." The NEQ's great advantage over any energy efficiency and energy intensity schemes. We keep, Alberta is promoting energy intensity. The carbon emissions can go up, but we're doing it more efficiently. That's because it will, the NEQ will prevent this rebound effect where greenhouse gases can still rise. And this won't happen with NEQs unless corporate interests win exemptions. And we must have people's movements, of course, struggle to make sure that they don't get those exemptions. The energy budget fixes the country's total carbon units for the year. And I say it drops each year. And businesses will have to either adapt or fail within that framework. Now, the NEQs are normally geared to reduce carbon emissions, but they can also equally just be turned over to prevent energy shortages, whether it's just peak oil or whether it's terrorist attacks or anything like that. And Canada has no system, no national sharing system in place for such catastrophes, and it's hard to set one up in the chaos of a crisis. Well, British proponents of tradable energy quotas have thought through the switch over to energy shortage crises. Well, what happens to refuseniks? People, if you can't be bothered with the whole thing, you can flog your entire ration as soon as you receive it, but when you have to buy fuel in the future, you will automatically be charged for the units necessary to cover your purchase. Refuseniks will pay ever more dearly for their indifference. The NEQ budget tightens. People will be encouraged to think up new and cooperative ways of cutting their consumption, such as car sharing, David Strahan writes. The system would soon get people out of their cars altogether, tipping the balance in favor of walking, cycling, or public transport for shorter or discretionary journeys. Now, we can't assume, as we did in the war, that the sharing ethic is there for the carbon energy descent. We're going to have to build a consensus around that. But the gradual nature of the NEQ's plan will, I think, likely make it, give it greater support. So there has been much research done on tradable energy quotas, but how they would work. They haven't actually been tried, but there's been a lot of research. And this has, been adopted in principle in Britain. The European is being, it's really been imported, exported to the European community, European Union. But I'm going to, so there's a lot of thinking about it, but I pose the following questions about the plan. First, will externalities, international power markets, and the full life cycle of products get properly accounted in calculating a fuel's total greenhouse gases? Second, will NEQs be top-down like other proposed solutions? How can we ensure that the plan would be democratic and be democratic from below, and the local communities, workers taking the initiative like we've talked about in this conference? If it impacts big energy users, would it not be subject to lobbying campaigns, alternative proposals, and watered-down measures? Is it naive about the actual operation of markets? It assumes a perfect regulatory system and political consensus, which don't yet exist, or a political consensus. Will it encourage crime like other rationing systems? If Canada starts a national energy quota system and the US doesn't, how much fuel smuggling across the border would occur? Despite the claims about the NEQ's redistributive effects, I mean, one of certainly at the beginning it would be redistributive because the poor would tend not to use all of their energy, and then they could get an income by selling theirs. Would the rich continue to find ways around them? So these questions are not meant to shoot down the NEQ idea, but we must ask tough questions of any new system. Now, Canada has two big advantages in this. First, we get 59% of our electricity from hydro and a growing portion from wind, solar, and other renewables. They would not be part of the NEQ plan. So We're talking just about a carbon energy descent, and so the other fuels are not, you don't have to pay for those, and it would encourage that. Secondly, NEQs would make it in Canadians' collective interest to phase out carbon energy exports to free up more carbon energy for domestic use. Producing rather than using carbon energy is Canada's greatest source of greenhouse gases. So it's not the transportation that Canadians use, the vehicles, it's actually in the making of sands oil and other forms of oil for export, mainly for export, which is our biggest source of greenhouse gases in this country. So there would be in the Canadians' interest to phase out those exports. Canadians' carbon energy use is actually closer to the British level than the wasteful American level if you take out the exports and all those carbon emissions because of our production for export. Declining carbon energy exports will put downward pressures on the NEQ carbon price. Ordinary Canadians would have a strong incentive to support phasing out carbon energy exports and be a political counterweight to the influence of big oil and workers in the sands and other carbon fuel exporting industries. Okay, I'm almost finished here. Right.
Would you like to open it up for discussion, and you can maybe add some concluding remarks right at the end?
Okay, well, I'll finish off on this. I'll finish on a note of hope here. The world's eco-energy problems are daunting, but with steely determination we can overcome them. Challenges are not what deter humans. We are built with the brains and ingenuity to overcome. But we can get sidetracked by bogus ideas or get discouraged by the prophets of doom. Yes, the petro elites have enormous power, and the mainstream media is mainly controlled by those with big money allied with big oil. So are most governments. But we have one thing on our side. This is a struggle for our lives, those of our children, and all other living things. If we can win over most people to the cause, we will have the numbers. In a democracy, that counts. Frances Moore Lappé agrees that climate change is with us and it's too late to prevent suffering, but it's not too late for life, she contends. And I quote, "When facing staggering setbacks from the Black Death of the 14th century to world wars, killing over 100 million people in the 20th, most human beings don't end up ruining life. What makes us miserable isn't a big challenge, it's feeling futile, alone, confused, discounted, in a word, powerless. By contrast, those confronting daunting obstacles, but joined with others in common purpose, have, to me, seemed to be the most alive." Okay, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I think that's a perfect talk to start off a Sunday morning, a day here at the conference where we'd like to build on what we've learned over the past couple days to start thinking as concretely as possible about what needs to happen next. So I know there will be lots of questions. I think if it sounds okay to you, Gord, we'll take maybe 3 and you can address them.
Sounds good.
And in identifying people, I'm going to strive to give people who haven't talked a chance, aim for gender balance and a bit of as much parity as possible in terms of where questions are coming from. Let's start here. Yep.
Yes, Dr. Laxer, I'm very delighted to listen to your very extensive, actually research and comprehensive talk. And this is very complex issue. As far as the carbon energy is concerned, my thinking is that 2 big issues or 2 factors. First is production. The other one is distribution. So as far as production is concerned, there's domestic production as well, international one. Now, you mentioned extensive on both issues. The first thing is about Alberta. Conventional oil and gas from the well are depleting. Secondary recovery is very expensive and require a lot of water. So people more or less abandon it. So the main source is oil sand. Oil sand, you mentioned about the production of carbon dioxide, the environmental issues, expensive to produce. So there is a vicious circle. If the oil price going down to $75 per gallon, then the production will be cut because the company wouldn't make profits at all. So therefore, the lower price, the less production will be there. So in general, that would be the domestic production. Now internationally, the oil reserve of Saudi Arabia never precisely quantified. This is huge, but we don't know how much. The Iraq is producing, but because the political situation is not going to be accessible readily. The United States, the Bacon shale play production is very high at the beginning, but you're right, it's going to be lower down, decreasing, because the fracture will be tightening, and therefore it's very difficult to keep it opening and produce more gas. So that's a technical problem as well. So,
okay, let's
so
give
my
Gordon.
question is this, right? I know, because in order to come to my question, therefore I say, now distribution is concerned, the oil price is the part of it. So my question is now, if there is a rationing, there's international ration or not, because we bound by the international trade agreement, right? What about domestically? Would we be able, Canada, to reserve amount of energy, carbon energy, for domestic production or use it by the Canadians? That's my question. I'm sorry, but I had to come to my question. I know why I'm asking this question. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Let's see, Hans, we'll take two more. All right, let's go right up there, Jerry in the blue shirt. No, a little further up.
I was wondering on these sort of national energy quotas, I was wondering if you could give a bit more information about how that relates to global trade. Because I've heard, for example, Germany being praised for having high levels of energy efficiency, but I've also heard that they're importing a large number of goods, therefore the carbon footprint is actually being offset to other nations. And specifically with the United States as well, they have the high internal use of carbon footprint, but they also blame China, and China's basically supplying manufactured goods for the rest of the world. So I'm just sort of wondering how the national versus global interaction of this works.
Okay, good.
Let's,
what, the third one?
sure, let's say the fellow I almost gave a turn to last time, the other blue shirt.
So given that we have to get off the carbon fuels and solar and wind power have their own problems, what should we be looking for as a power source in the future?
Okay, let me start with this national versus global. I'm arguing in this book that Canada should get out of its role as a resource exporter and a carbon exporter. Our old hewers of wood role actually makes us into a huge carbon exporter, and it locks us into the carbon economy and production, and we have to get off of that. We can get out of international agreements. I think that this is actually the best time, to get out of the obligation to send oil and gas to the United States with their boom. They're in a bit of a boom now for the next few years. They're feeling much less constrained about their imports. So this is a time when Canada could say to the U.S., we are going to phase out energy exports. We actually did this in the 1970s when there was the energy crisis, the OPEC crisis, there was a crisis of energy supply. Canada was the biggest exporter of oil to the United States in 1973, and we told them in 1974, we are going to phase out oil exports, and we almost did it by 1982. We brought it down to about 20% of what we had exported. And the US did not invade, and they didn't. Now, they didn't have NAFTA at that point, but we're going to have a campaign. We can get out of NAFTA in 6 months. We have, I think every country is going to have to use its, to start to rely on its own national and local energy resources. On the question of, the first question, yeah, I mean, to some extent it's the same question. It's talking about international agreements. Well, you raised questions about Saudi Arabia and others that, I don't know if I can go into that now. I mean, yes, Saudi Arabia has had 260 billion barrels of oil as their official reserve since about 1989, and it hasn't declined and hasn't changed. And they raised it between 1988 and 1990, about 5 or 6 countries in OPEC all raised their reserves. You know, in OPEC, you get to export oil depending on how much your reserves are. So these are political reserves. We have no idea how much Saudi Arabia has, and it's very much doubts that they have as much as they say. Yeah, okay, I think that's it.
All right, I'm also interested in parity within the room, so how about some questions from over here? There's one in the back row. Can we go up to the top? Is that gonna work? All right. Okay, we need the mic. I'm told I'm sorry, can you just wait a minute? It's because we're recording. Thank you.
How safe is it for Canada to increase its amount of power using nuclear generators?
Okay.
Okay, and then we'll take one right here.
I agree what you're saying about the renewables not being the single answer, like the utility scale efficiency is not there. I was wondering how a lot of people are looking at the localizing of energy production, so having to rethink how we get our energy on a daily basis, putting the driving demand for efficiency in the hands of the consumers, right? So elaborate on domestic production, working with the energy quotas you were talking about, and how that can help the reduction of the powering down kind of movement.
Okay.
Take one more. Okay, we'll go up there in the gray shirt.
Hi, Jeff's question sort of touched on this, but my concern is, I mean, when we've seen sort of national efforts towards green technologies, environmental sustainability in the past, we've ended up exporting a lot of our harms to people in developing countries, people in poverty. I'm wondering if a national energy sort of quota system is adequately addressing that potential of simply offshoring a lot of that destructive use into developing countries, and how you might plan for or account for that potential harm.
Good. Okay, how safe is nuclear? It's not safe at all. I mean, no country has figured out where to put the uranium. It takes thousands of years to break down. Uranium produces 14%. We produce 14% of our electricity from nuclear. The industry is touting nuclear as carbon-free, and this is a great alternative to oil and natural gas and coal, and it isn't. We are now going to the lower grades of uranium, and you have to dig up a lot of earth. If you look at the life cycle of producing uranium, there have been some calculations that it may actually use more carbon than oil and natural gas. But the main thing is, I think we have alternatives, and that there is no safe way of storing the stuff. Secondly, renewables not, okay, the domestic production. What I'm advocating is that Canada phase out the sands, that we phase out oil and natural gas exports, and that we live on Canadian conventional oil, which is declining, non-fracked. And as that declines, we should be cutting our energy use at least at that same level. There is no good reason that Canadians consume way more oil and natural gas than Nordic countries. Norway and Sweden, we use way more energy than they do. They are as much northern people as we are, vast countries with small populations. If they can get down to there with their standard of living, we can do it too. Green tech, okay, what about sharing with other countries in the developing world? Yes, it would be great to have international plans. We should, obviously, the rich countries should be helping out on that. But we have to make sure that we're actually helping out rather than just trying to find new markets, which is what the big oil will try to do. You have to make sure that an energy descent is, actually gets rid of carbon, is a carbon energy descent. On the issue of energy as a human right, Exxon jumped onto this idea a few years ago because they hoped, if there was a world program to give some extra money to people in less developed countries, that this would be a new energy market for them. So we have to make sure that what we do is actually helping these countries, and it should be, fit into their plans and not something that we impose on them.
All right. Oh, okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up at this point. I'm reasonably sure that Gordon would be more than happy to take questions and continue this discussion. I know this is something that he is passionate about, as are many of us in the room. So please join me in thanking Dr. Laxer for his presentation today.